Hey, PreSales Collective, it's your host, James Kaikis, and today I'm going to be joined by Wendy McHenry, Senior Solutions Consulting Effectiveness Manager at Pegasystems. Wendy is also a member of our WISE Council. The topic of today's episode is scaling the right way. We all know that pre-sale scaling is a tough task. Many times we are dependent on our sales counterparts and the rest of the go-to-market organization. And so in today's episode, Wendy is going to talk about her plethora of experience as it comes to scale. You may have heard Wendy talk about an aspect of scale at her session in the Executive Summit. It's a topic that she's extremely passionate about and has a lot of experience. And so definitely enjoy today's episode. Today's episode is sponsored by Proverity. In this highly competitive, ever-changing environment, it is key to show continuous value. Proverity Cloud does just that by providing the necessary collaboration, crucial data, and real-time insights throughout the customer lifecycle so that pre-sales teams can remain agile and can unlock sustainable revenue growth. For more information, visit proverity.com. Wendy, welcome to the PreSales Podcast. How are you this morning?
I'm great. How are you, James?
I am great. I feel like we talk pretty frequently, but this is the first podcast that we're on together.
It is. I'm very excited to be on the podcast. You have a great collection of podcast topics, by the way.
I appreciate the compliment. I like to think that I have a great collection of amazing guests that come on the podcast, including yourself. And I'm just being a good sales engineer and being curious and asking questions. Honestly, Wendy, I just want to say thank you so much because you're so involved in the PreSales Collective. You're part of our leadership collective. You're on the WISE Council. You've spoken at the Leadership Symposium. You've spoken at the Exec Summit. So I just really want to say thanks, and I'm glad to have you on the podcast.
Thank you so much, James. I'm so passionate about pre-sales, and I love talking about pre-sales with others because I think everyone should be considering a pre-sales career, and I wish I had found out about it sooner.
I agree. I think we all do, right? Best job no one's ever heard of. We're trying to change that. But Wendy, let's talk about you. You said you wish you got here earlier. What got you here? Tell us about your pre-sales journey.
So I was working as an IT administrator, and I was participating in my first enterprise software purchase. And the sales engineer came in to present to us. And I thought, wait a minute, how does this person have this job? What, he just sits here and he's talking about technology all day? How can I get that job? And that's literally was my first exposure to sales engineering. At the time, I had been working with SaaS. I'm a statistician by trade. That's actually my background. And I moved into being a sales engineer at SaaS. And so that was how I made that jump from my background as a SaaS user and then a SaaS administrator into a sales engineer. And then eventually later, I led the inside sales pre-sales team for the Americas at SaaS. And now I am at Pega. And when I first came to Pega, I led a financial services pre-sales team, and now I'm in solutions consulting effectiveness, where I have the opportunity to lead best practices for pre-sales enablement, for collaboration, operations, talent attraction and retention, and our sales execution. So I get to touch all parts of the pre-sales business, which I love, and I get to work with all of our pre-sales engineers globally.
I love that journey. It's amazing to hear, Wendy. And, it's one of my favorite transitions into pre-sales. So actually, Brett Kemke's at Gainsight was just on the podcast talking about bringing in non-traditional talent. And that was actually what he talked about as one of the things that he looks for is someone who's in IT, who owns a software and tries to get them to make that jump into becoming a sales engineer to sell the software. You making that transition is amazing to hear. And you've got a lot of great experience in scaling. Which brings us to today's topic of scaling the right way. What is your experience when it comes to scaling pre-sales organizations?
So first of all, I'll say I'm a planner. So anyone that knows me personally knows that I'm a planner. Like my husband will say, oh gosh, you have another list for me? Yes, I absolutely am a planner. And scaling is all about your plan for growth. So you set your target. How do you get there? So I'm typically looking for longer term growth. So I'm looking a year to 3 years. And what do we need to get there? Set that goal and then make that plan. So maybe you're planning on growing your revenue by a certain percentage. What are the things you need to support that growth? I think as pre-sales, we are always growing. We have the pace of change in technology, which is very rapid. We have to continually adapt. And it's also why I say the best SEs are the continuous learners, right? It's needed to excel at our job. So certainly at Pega, what brought me here was I wanted to be a part of that growth. Pega had this goal to become $1 billion company. And I wanted to get on that rocket ship. I could see that they had been experiencing this rapid growth. And I had no idea at that time the extreme rapid growth Pega was going to experience. We hit that $1 billion mark as a company. From the time I joined to now, we've grown from 4,000 to 6,000 company-wide. So certainly we have seen a lot of growth on the team. That means we've had a lot of hiring going on. And that is why the solutions consulting effectiveness team was created, was to help from a change management perspective, help with that growth and help with that plan. And how do we get there and how do we scale the team?
That's such an interesting perspective. And I do want to say, I really appreciate your comment about the best SEs are the continuous learners, because you're right. Our world is evolving around us, and we as sales engineers have to adapt. We have to keep up. And I think it's so interesting that you're in this role as SE effectiveness and trying to bring that to the masses, right? Bringing that to scale, because tribal knowledge is just something that is in part of companies as they grow. But as you grow and add people, it's impossible to scale that knowledge base. And so having someone in your role that is bringing best practices into collaboration, into operations, to bring in talent is amazing. I actually feel like we can have a whole podcast on SC effectiveness and this role and its impact for sure. But let's distill this down. I'm curious, Wendy, on your perspective of the core tenets of scaling a pre-sales organization. What are those, and are they any different than scaling other parts of an organization?
From my perspective, I think of it as scaling your current team, hiring new staff, deploying new technology, and creating reporting systems to measure and manage results. Those are the key things that I see in a pre-sales organization. You're going to focus on your biggest lift first, but usually your first step here is mapping your SEs to your AEs. So that makes us a little bit unique. So each year, your pre-sales leadership and sales leadership is going through that motion. What is the planned growth for the sales organization? And what headcount does pre-sales need to support that? So that's usually what I think most teams think of when they think of scale, is just the headcount. It goes beyond the headcount, but that is the first step. Because of that, I do think it's different than in other parts of the organization because of that tight partnership with the sales team, but also partially because we are a revenue generating organization. I mean, let's be honest here, James, the budget to support growth will go to the revenue generating teams.
Pre-sales tends to be in a reactive position to growth because it's the sales counterparts and the alignments and assignments. But what about everything else that we're doing, right? From keeping up with the technology and understanding industry best practices. What's your approach there?
It's making sure you have a plan so that your teams can stay up to date. So what are those communication plans to your teams? What are the enablement plans to make sure that your teams are enabled and up to date on those skills? Or are you lucky enough to have, for example, a competitive intelligence team that they are tasked with that? And then they're going out and they're calling that competitive information. And then they are tasked as well with making sure the pre-sales teams are up to date so that when you are doing your demo, you're able to call out your competitive differentiators. That's where it starts. Who's going to be responsible for that competitive intelligence? When you're a smaller team, the SEs are responsible for that, let's be honest, right? And then over time, as you grow, what's that plan to get to the competitive intelligence team? So where does that fall in your long-term strategic plan where, okay, once I'm at this point, now I can support having a competitive intelligence team who will perform that function for me?
So Wendy, where have you seen the most success? Because that's super interesting. And I'm sitting here reflecting back on my experiences and thinking, what was our business like during hypergrowth? How proactive were we? How reactive were we? So where have you seen the most success? And having a plan is one thing, but like what tactically are teams doing that allow them to scale successfully?
So first of all, the teams that don't shy away from adapting, the ones that adapt and are agile and shift their approach are going to be the most successful. Personally, I always look out in January. My fiscal year is January to December. I look in January, okay, what are the goals for the next 12 months? I think of that as a short-term window. And what are the things we need to do to get there? And it might be, so for your example, and I've done that where we've made that shift from a pooled model to an alignment model and making that shift. And it's the teams that are like, okay, let's do this, let's go. And it's setting up the let's go do this together mentality to adapt and make that shift that I think is most successful. So it's being open to the change. I think it's having the change management program in place and definitely your communication. Why are we doing this? What's the why that's driving this change? And being transparent about that, why we're needing to move from a pooled model to an alignment model. What's in it for the SE? What's in it for our sales counterparts by us making this shift? And then, of course, the best practices of knowledge sharing. If you've heard us talk about this on other platforms, the knowledge sharing is making sure you have that structure in place. So to your point, you made it a few minutes ago, if every SE is creating their demo in a silo and they're not sharing with each other, everyone is starting from scratch. So what's your plan to scale that growth? Because that's a very limited amount of clients you can reach through that model. So how are you going to help enable so people are not starting from scratch, but instead have some sort of demo catalog they can work from? So they're leveraging each other's work. And so the tribal knowledge is then shared across the team. And so it's taken out of their mind. And instead of saying, oh, I know I should talk to James because I know James knows that topic, I instead have a place I can go and leverage James's demo.
I'm sitting here reflecting back on my experiences in my career, like, oh, go talk to this person, go talk to that person. And it just doesn't work. It doesn't work long term. And one of the things that you brought up was the agility and ability to adapt. I can't help myself but say the teams that say, well, this is how we do things here, or this is how we've always done things. That mentality dies in a fast moving environment. Because you have to adapt to your surroundings. You have to adapt to the competitive landscape, your product landscape, your buyer, most importantly. So I like that you've talked about that. I talk to so many leaders, Wendy, who really can't get their head out of the water, though. Their organizations are scaling and moving so fast. They're doing so many things. They're juggling more things than they actually have the capacity to. So it's hard for them to plan 6 months, let alone 1 to 2 to 3 years. What are your thoughts, though, to those leaders, especially the pre-sales organizations that are fairly reactive when it comes to scale and they can't get proactive and they feel like they're always behind?
I completely have empathy for that feeling. I think many of us have been there at one point or another in our careers. And that's where, again, I really do encourage people to take that time to step back. I think when you are in that reactive mode, it is so hard to do that. It is incredibly valuable. Time blocking, I'm a big fan of time blocking on your calendar. If you can start to block that time, even if it's an hour in a day, to stop and think back and look at the 30,000 foot view and break it down into manageable chunks and goals and set those goals. I think you will find just if you start doing that, you'll start to get that momentum going. And for me, it's all about getting it on the calendar. Honestly, that is so important. And turn off your phone, your email, whatever it takes to get you focused. Or if it's stepping away from your desk, I have a friend of mine who does this actually. He goes on a hike at the end of the day. And he's like, my manager has learned that that's my thinking time. And I come out of that with 2 or 3 ideas out of every hike I go on. And it's finding those times when you can disengage from the reactionary of the emails and the pings of the instant messenger to let yourself think through and be able to act more strategically.
You know, it's funny that you say that because that resonates with me is that I posted on LinkedIn, surprise, surprise, maybe about a year ago. And I made a mention of time blocking your calendar to find space to think. For me, when I was still at Salesforce and running the PreSales Collective, I essentially had to build that in to try to figure out how to bring my best self to both works. And I had so many people comment, that's impossible. I could never do that. How could you actually find time in your day? but it's such an important piece of taking a step back to move forward, to take a step back and analyze the situation so that you can be proactive and you can have a strategy, like you mentioned, into the approach of scale. One of the things that you've mentioned to me previously was a foundation, having a foundation to build upon. That's where I'm curious is like, what is a foundation of scale? You've talked about carving out the time to be able to think strategically, but what is the foundation of scale?
I think of it as the basic physical and organizational structure for the operations of the business. It comes down to, for me, and I know you've heard me say this before, it's the people, the technology, and the process. So it's not only how they physically do the job with the tech and business process behind their job, right? So the business process of pre-sales could be, how do you request an SE's time? How is that done? And then how are they then allocated to an opportunity? How does that work? What are the processes behind their time tracking, for example? And then what is the technology they use to do their job? Is the demo environment on their laptop? Is it somewhere else? Who manages those? But it's also their roles. So what is the scope of their responsibility? And when are they called in for that part of the sales process? That also comes into play as you scale because the responsibility might change. So one thing we had done when we moved from a pooled model to an aligned model was we also then had to create a whole rubric around assignment. And it was, if it's this kind of opportunity, these are the 3 people that can support it. But it was thinking through strategically, who would be the 3 best people for that type of opportunity? So for example, if it's financial services, who are the 3 people that have enterprise experience in financial services? Who's got the architecture background that can help in financial services? So then you know, if I need this type of SE, these are the 3 people that are going to be assigned to that particular opportunity. But then what if they're not available? So you're working through that whole process. So it's people, process, technology, I think make up the foundation. And then it's really analyzing not only, okay, who are my existing people? What are their scope of responsibilities? But then as I'm hiring and growing my team, what are the traits I'm looking for and the roles and responsibilities that person would be taking on?
I'm just thinking back to my experiences. I think as a leader, for me, I put a lot of energy in the process aspect of things when it came to scale. And some of the feedback that I would get from my sales counterparts was I wasn't flexible enough. But some of the inertia that I think you face as a pre-sales leader when it comes to scale is that it's important to have process to allow our teams to be effectively utilized by the sales counterparts that they're being utilized by. But sometimes your sales organization wants you to be flexible and fluid and do what's right by the customer, and that can clash. So, I'm a firm believer of putting process in place for scale and efficiencies to allow the technology and the people aspect to overperform. And that's just a personal thing that's resonated with me.
I completely agree. And it's not going to supersede the natural relationships we have with our sales counterparts. You are not going to get away from, but I worked with James the last time I had this kind of opportunity and I want James again. That is still going to happen.
That's always going to happen, right? If someone's doing a good job, you're always going to want that. But at the same time, as a pre-sales leader, we're also trying to manage their workloads and making sure that employees are putting their best foot forward to all the opportunities that they're working. Wendy, this gets me thinking about the talent aspect. Sometimes people are better fit for smaller companies and sometimes people are better fit for bigger companies. So talk to me about why getting the talent aspects of scale is so critical to success.
I think that is a great point. It comes down to what are the traits that you need to really be successful in the role. And I think the traits of a successful SE 10 years ago are different than the traits of the successful SE today. So how you're hiring today, I bet is probably different than it was 10 years ago. At least it should be, because what our SEs are being called upon to do, I think there's so much more on our plates now as SEs than there were 10 years ago. And it also comes down to, again, the roles and responsibilities of what we're asking them to do. So when you're a smaller company, as an SE, and we mentioned this, you're wearing a lot of different hats. You're performing a lot of different roles. And I think as the company grows, as the team grows, the roles and responsibilities can become more niche. So you might be able to specialize in one particular area as the team has grown, where you might not have had that opportunity with a smaller company. So I think that's where it also comes down to, well, this is the part of being an SE I really love. If I can do that 80% of my day, then that's what I want to go do. And in a smaller company, that might not be possible because you have to wear so many different hats. I think it comes down to having very honest conversations with our talent in terms of what is it that you love about this role? So for example, if they say, I don't really like working with the clients, well, then you probably should not be in a pre-sales role. But if they say, my favorite part of the job is working with clients, we want to make sure then that they're in a role where they are working with clients as much as possible and they're out getting to demo and do more of consultative work with the client. And if that really energizes them, then you want to give them a role where they have the opportunity to shine there. Because if you have your people in the right seat, that's going to supercharge you moving forward.
I think that's a really good point and very well said, Wendy. Let's get really honest here. Is there a way to ensure your employees are growing with the company versus falling behind? I asked this question because we brought Tristan Tao, PSLC Council member, on the podcast, and he's been at Iterable through tremendous growth. And what he attributes to is that him and a lot of his peers have grown with the company. And he said that it's actually really hard to do, but they've grown and pushed themselves as the company grow. That gave them new opportunities. That doesn't always happen. So I'm curious your thoughts on this.
Well, first of all, I think the most important thing from the pre-sales leadership is, again, to be transparent and share that why, ensuring that you are communicating why changes are happening, sharing the growth strategy and getting the buy-in. Again, it's that let's go together and build this together mentality. And how can you leverage your team's strengths to help you get there? I think it's setting challenging goals. So if people think back in their careers, were you happiest when challenges were being presented to you and you were growing? Or were you happier just sitting and doing? I think most of us as SEs are happier when we're being challenged and we're being pushed to grow. So if you're sharing with your team those opportunities and you're setting those goals for them, attainable goals, right? It's important to have attainable goals, but sharing that challenge, like, hey, this is what we're trying to get to. Let's go and help me figure out how we're going to get there and work together. And that's a really fun challenge to be a part of. And I think that as well, it's what's the change management plan? Do you have one? But certainly that can be the hard truth, right? Sometimes some of your team members will not want to be a part of that future vision. So maybe the employee was a high performer the way things used to be, but again, they're not interested in doing those other things that we mentioned, right? So not as much as the team grows and scales. Perhaps they were better suited when you were a small team or a small company. But again, as a leader, it's all about developing your talent. And sometimes you are developing them for their next career step. I have had SEs on my teams move into product management. I've had them move into tech support. I've had them move into professional services. And then the flip side, I've had people come to me from professional services, from tech support. So it's all about what is that journey. And I think as long as you're giving people, again, those opportunities to grow, we want them to stay within the company for a long time. The great thing about pre-sales, though, I really do think there are so many opportunities to continually learn that as long as you are a continuous learner, I think those natural continuous learners will want to stay in pre-sales as you scale and grow.
That really hits home on a lot of points. And I like that you talked about the hard truth. And sometimes you're right. People are better suited in a different role within the company. I actually think that should be a leader's job to understand if somebody is a good employee, but not the right fit for your team, and maybe they're not very happy, help them get there. Help them get to somewhere where they can succeed. Because at the end of the day, a manager's job is really to maximize the potential of their employees. I think it's always our job to figure out what is this person capable of? And can I help them get there or help them get themselves there? That's always important. And it's hard, when you talk about losing talent, you'd rather keep good talent within your company just in a different role. And it actually can benefit you on the pre-sales side if you have someone who goes to post-sale or customer success and they have that continuity, right? They're going to be a better ally, a better asset to you in that sales process, ideally. As we talk about employees, we talk about people in terms of scale, Wendy, I want your thoughts on scaling with diversity, equality, equity, and inclusion in mind. How do companies scale with DEE in mind?
I absolutely think that this is where what we've been talking about comes into play. I think you absolutely can put DEI front and center. As you look at the overall team and people's strengths, you can consider, okay, as I grow, these people have these strengths that I can use to grow my team as well. Then you can broaden the pool of candidates you're looking at because you can be looking for the traits you want to hire versus just the experience. So for example, if I have someone on my team who is my super senior SE and they have the deep technical knowledge, and then I have someone with that deep industry expertise, but might not have the same depth of technology. By pairing them together, that's really creating some great leverage for you when you're working with clients because you can bring both their voices in. So that's where I think you can be looking more broadly. And it's not only a diverse candidate in terms of what we look like, but it's what we bring to the table, the diversity of our backgrounds and experiences.
So well said, Wendy. And I always reflect back to your session with David Malouf at the Leadership Symposium over the summer, the discussion around getting away from our traditional norm. And one of the things that David mentioned is we as pre-sales professionals have been fishing in the same pond for a long time. And we need to start looking outside. And I love that you continue to talk about traits because it isn't always about, oh, this person has done demos for the last 5 or 10 years. When I worked at Salesforce, I told people this all the time. I worked in manufacturing. And so what I was trying to do was find manufacturing experts and teach them sales engineering because they walked into a room with manufacturers with a lot more credibility than I did. That's for sure. So, there's a lot of benefit in bringing diversity into the team. I would say, Wendy, one of the things that I felt this myself, was there's sometimes such a demand on the business. And as we talked about, wearing multiple hats, doing so many things, that when it comes to people and bringing in the right talent, it's almost easier for people to go to their networks to make the easy hire instead of making the right hire and running the right process, which in my opinion is the most important aspect of bringing diversity into an organization is running that right process. But because the demands of the organization are so heavy, people take shortcuts because it's easier. It needs a change now so it can better affect the longer term as we scale the people aspect of pre-sales with DEI in mind.
I absolutely agree. And, I have a counterpart who has said, I get pressure from the sales side to fill this position as soon as possible. I need it filled yesterday. I can't wait for a diverse candidate. I would encourage them to shift that perspective a little bit. What about the hiring process can be changed? Is it the job description? Is it the where we're looking? Is it how we're posting our jobs or where we're posting our jobs? So it goes way beyond our network because my understanding of the statistics is that the more you hire people that look just like you, the less successful those companies are. You want to expand those traits that you're looking for. And if you will forgive the analogy, I read this the other day and I thought it was so perfect. It's like the Armageddon movie problem. Are you training the oil rig drillers to be astronauts or are you training the astronauts to be the oil rig drillers? That's absolutely what's happening here. If I have someone who can think analytically and who's passionate about technology, I'm more interested in their life experiences than whether or not they've ever demoed software before.
Well said, Wendy. I absolutely agree with you there. And I think that's the challenge we'll continue to put out to more people listening to this, hiring managers, is don't make the easy choice or don't take shortcuts in this process, because you're doing not only yourself a disservice, but the pre-sales profession generally as well. Wendy, this has been really fun. I feel like I can ask you a million questions about scale all day, but let's end on an advice question. For those within an organization that just don't really know where to start as it relates to scale, where should they?
I really would encourage everyone to look holistically and evaluate your people, your processes, and your technologies, and understand what will bring you the biggest lift to adapt. So as we talked about earlier, if your SEs aren't assigned to AEs, but they're a pooled model, perhaps your biggest lift here would be in designing an alignment model and maybe creating a ticketing request process, something to document and capture information from the account executives about what they need so that you can identify the best talent to help with that particular opportunity. But it's really taking that look, block that hour on your calendar and take that time to evaluate your people, process, technology. And I would encourage you to set a goal in each of those buckets for 2022. What are the things I can do to elevate my people, process, and technology? One thing from each for next year.
Wendy, I'm going to invite anybody who does this, they can message you and I on Slack and we'll check in with them. We'll hold them accountable. I'd be happy to do so. I'm signing you up for it. So I hope you're
would
okay
love that. That's awesome.
Wendy, it's been a pleasure having you on the podcast. I really appreciate everything that you do for the PreSales Collective, for the profession generally. Thank you. And we'll talk soon.
Thank you for having me, James.
My pleasure. See you next time. All right, PreSales Collective, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Personally, I had a lot of flashbacks in today's episode as the things that I did not do well in my startup experience as it related to scale. When Wendy distills scale down, she talks about foundation. She talks about people, technology, and process. And I think that's the best way to think about scale as it comes to pre-sales. What are the processes that you have in place when you have 1 or 2 employees compared to 5 to 10 to 50 to 100? How does the technology change during that scale as well? And most importantly, what about your people? Are the people that join your team in the beginning when it's only 1 or 2 the same people and the right fit as you grow into a much larger organization that might rely on specialization? Wendy believes that if you have a mindset of continuously learning and you're a team that is both adaptable and agile, you can scale with the organization and the organization's needs. One of the things Wendy challenged us with was talking about the why, communicating, change management. Those are important aspects of scale. But as a leader, sometimes it can be really hard to think about scale, where sometimes we can be so reactive in our role and we can be spinning so many plates at one time that it's hard to strategically plan for 6, 12, 24, 36 months down the road. So take Wendy's advice and take a step back. Block your calendar and set time aside to think strategically. Think about what's working, what's not working. Do I have the right people? Do I have the right technology and process to scale? Am I doing the right things that allow me to grow as a leader? Am I effectively growing and enabling my team? These are all things that we need to be thinking about with scale. And it's sometimes so hard to just take a step back, but that is the challenge that we're going to put on everybody. You can message myself or Wendy in the PreSales Collective Slack. We're happy to hold you accountable. Think about scale as it relates to people, technology, and process. And as you approach 2022, think about what you and your team could be doing better. As I mentioned at the end of the podcast, when it comes to hiring with diversity, equality, equity, and inclusion in mind, we need to run the right process. We need to be better about running a process to find diversity and talent and diversity and experience to bring to our teams for hiring someone from our network, someone that we know. We've all done it. I've done it myself as well, but we have to be better about that to usher in a new wave of pre-sales professionals to meet the supply and demand issues that exist in this profession. All right, PreSales Collective, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. This is the last episode in 2021. I'm feeling very grateful for your listenership and your support, and I really do appreciate it. See you next time.